apologize for that. I don't have any way around it. We have to go back a little bit in order to set up for what we're going to be covering this semester. And we did some of that on last week. We did, basic theories of how societies get formed, and we talked about foundational principles, and we talked about the Americas. But we're going to start with where our story for this class starts, by looking at the place where everything seems to happen. But for those of you who took World Civ or 2321, a lot of this is going to be review. And if you're in my 1301 class, a lot of it you literally heard yesterday. So I apologize if there was a way around that, but there really is not. So at the center of civilized life is the Mediterranean. If you look at the structure of the world map, and do I have that? I don't, of course. It's at the center of all of the trading that is happening in the in the connected world around the 1400s and 1500s, and even earlier than that. It starts off as the center of where trading life begins. So we have to talk about the history of the Mediterranean. Fighting over the Mediterranean. Hold on. Oh, I'm looking for my notes and they're not on my computer because I printed them out and then lost them. Okay. So, warrior cultures formed around this body of water. The ability to hold any part of this coastline inspired whole armies to form. The ability to hold any part of this coastline is how city-states got formed. As we talked about on the first day of class, we talked about how primitive societies start as family groups, and then they turn into villages, and then they turn into tribes, and then a strong core group of people, or even a single person, steps up and starts to take leadership and build a city. The ability to hold land at the edge of this particular body of water is by definition what a strong man actually is in the ancient world. You can see that this is ancient Mesopotamia. This is where Egypt would have been, and all of the royalty of Egypt was in the Upper Nile, pouring into the Mediterranean, was in the northern Nile, which is actually the lower Nile, pouring into the Mediterranean. All along here, we have ancient city-states that formed massive armies like Athens and Sparta and ancient Greece, specifically so that they could trade with other cultures around this body of water. It was based on that some of the bigger civilizations rose in a time when civilizations weren't really that advanced, like for instance the Phoenicians, because they were able to trade across the water and with other settlements, establish colonies even from one piece of land to another across this water. The whole Mediterranean society got connected to each other. The Phoenicians, for example, were a shipping and boating culture. They sailed from one port to another and they traded. And because of that, they had to develop a way to communicate across linguistic boundaries. And so they invented an alphabet that was based on sound, symbols for sounds instead of pictures for words. And because they were able to do that, somebody who spoke multiple languages was able to read in just one language, even though they were, after they sounded it out, it would be words in Greek or words in Phoenician or words from Egypt. They were able to transmit a message from one to the other because they invented this idea of symbols for sounds, which we use today. Our alphabet is not made up of pictures of cats and things like that. They're made up of symbols for sounds. And this is because of trading across the Mediterranean. It was critically important to connect all of these cultures together. So in the ancient world, with the settlements, Greek settlements, Phoenician settlements, Egyptian settlements, with the Etruscans, that's a whole nother thing. The connectivity between all these cultures turned the Mediterranean into a big highway. It's a great big highway between cultures, okay? And it stayed that way for many, many years, regardless of what else was happening. As a matter of fact, taking over other city-states so that you could control that highway was a big motivator for some of our bigger empires. When the Roman Empire rose, and Rome was just a city-state of Greece when it started. It was just a colony of Greece when it started. But when it rose and took over more and more and more of the land around the Mediterranean, it infused its culture into all of these places, and then they were connected by language, by coinage, by leadership. So here's a map that kind of shows you, this is where people ruled who were directly Roman, the senatorial provinces. Here are the places that were ruled by the empire and by locals who were appointed by Rome. So you might be a tribal king in this area up here, but you only get to keep your rule because the Roman emperor says you can. And then there were places further north and further south where treaties were negotiated with Rome. And because of that, Rome was incredibly powerful. So all around the Mediterranean, you now have common coins, common language, common culture. You have the local culture, but then you also have a little bit of Roman culture infused in it too, which comes from ancient Greek culture. We call that Hellenistic, the Hellenistic cultures. And as a result of that, the Mediterranean is a busy, busy, busy freeway. Constantly things going back and forth, constantly people moving. Control over those ports and control over those shipping lanes was incredibly important. The Mediterranean was also the place where the Silk Road poured out. So the Silk Road brought trade all the way from the very eastern part of China all the way across and pooled into the Mediterranean. Now, if you take World Civ I, you get to study how that Silk Road got built across all of these miles. But the Silk Road is both on the land and on the water. It has two components, and it's traveled over land and it's traveled over water. And what happens as people move across the Silk Road is they bring things from each region. So they might bring porcelain from here and horses from here, but it all pools in the Mediterranean. It all sort of lands in the middle of this Hellenistic culture. And the traders who bring it then take those philosophies, those practices, those songs, music, and those products back across the Silk Road to the east. So we're talking about a massive trade highway here that lasted for several hundred years, arguably for over 1,000 years, but it depends on when you start counting. So something changed in 600 with the rise of a prophet named Muhammad, who believed that he had been given a vision from heaven, that the interpretation of God's will had been read wrong by his predecessors, basically. He brought his vision and began to develop a following. And as he began to develop a following, he had a whole core group of people who did not partake in those products. You know, the Greeks traded wine and they traded luxury goods, the silk that came from China and all of these kinds of things. These things were forbidden under the practices of Islam. It was halal to eat certain foods, and it is permitted to eat certain things, but it's haram to take silk, pork, alcohol, luxury goods, items made of gold, items made just for luxury and no other reason. And this was the bulk of what was traded across the Mediterranean highway. So what happened as Islam began to spread, which it did very quickly, actually, Islam was like, it caught fire and began to spread very quickly, is that the Mediterranean trade hit a wall, an economic wall. Suddenly, if you go to the eastern part of the Mediterranean, you run into a whole coastal culture that has no interest in anything you have to give. That by their own practices can't take your money because they can only use their own. Won't speak your language because they only speak their own, because you know their language that they're using is a holy language to them, and to suddenly shift into another one is well, it's haram, it's forbidden. So suddenly across the Mediterranean you run into an economic highway, and we're not talking about a militant situation yet. We're talking about a place where suddenly they don't want what you have to sell and won't buy and won't give you what they have, so won't trade with you anyway. As a result of that, the Mediterranean becomes a border instead of a highway. So let's talk about what's happening on the east side of that border, and then we'll talk about what's happening on the west. Now Muhammad, and I cover a lot of this in World Civ I, so I'm going to skate right across it. But Muhammad rose to power on the basis of his gift of revelation, of his gift of message. He had been given There's somebody sitting out in the hallway. Should I tell them they can come in? Are you waiting for class? Are you okay? Okay. All right. Sorry. I forget the testing center is also right next door. Okay. He was given his following based on the fact that he had a powerful message that he claimed had been given to him directly by God, and the people who followed him believed it. And he ruled, he had control of his own following, of his own people for several years. Let's see, he ruled from 610 and then died in 632. So for about 22 years, he was in charge of this group of people, but then he died. And there was an argument about who should take over for him, because he had relatives, direct descendants who were part of his bloodline, and then he had followers who had been very close to him in his teachings. And the question became who should follow him, who should take over as, you know, the caliphate of this growing group of people. And they split right down the middle. Well, not really right down the middle, to be honest, but they split over who they believed should be Muhammad's successor. Should you inherit the leadership based on the fact that you are blood, or should you inherit it based on the fact that you're a strict follower of him and that you were his right-hand person while he was alive? So the Muslims split into two different factions, the Shia and the Sunni. And the Shiite Muslims, this was in a battle from about 656 to 661, called the First Fitna. Do I have that here? No. Okay, because I don't want to get into that here. That's World Civ 1. But the one of the movements was defined by its strictness, by its strict adherence. They had to adhere very closely to the teachings. And the other one was more organically, and it grew more organically. And as a result, one of them grew much bigger than the other one, and the other one became very factionalized. So generally speaking, when you hear of Muslim forces that are amassing in a militant way, what kind of Muslims are they? Do you know? They're Shiite, right? They're the ones that followed in that original, this is a strict thing. This is the early caliphs that followed the idea that this should be a bloodline thing, and that everything comes back to blood. And because everything comes back to blood, everything is, you have to fight for your right to maintain control. So it becomes very militant. Most of the Muslim, oh, that's exciting. Coming soon. Okay, most of the Muslim movement and growth is the Sunni. They're settling great big areas as they move into an area, and it's not exactly militant, but they say, we expect very, very big things from you if you're going to join us. Bet you can't do them. And then people do, and so they get to join. In a time when Hellenism had made everybody kind of wibbly wobbly on their feet, like, it happens a lot of times in pluralistic societies where you start to feel like there aren't really any rules, and you crave structure, you crave rules, you crave somebody telling you what to do instead of giving you permission to figure out what to do yourself. And as a result, movements that tend to create strict walls around you, that appeals to people, large groups of people, maybe not to individuals, but it appeals to large groups of people. So that was kind of how this movement grew. And on the other side of the Mediterranean was all of the, Hellenistic people that had all these products and language and practices that they couldn't interact with. So they separate along the Mediterranean. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and all of the things that they left behind are kind of on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. So that pool of knowledge that comes from ancient Greece, the ancient philosophers and all those kinds of things, as the Christian Romans step back away from the Mediterranean to put distance between them and to go further up into Europe, they leave a lot of that behind. They stop maintaining archives of it. They stop studying it. They stop all of that kind of stuff. One of the pillars of Islam is study. You have to understand the words of the Prophet, and therefore you have to be able to understand words. Therefore, the study of words becomes valuable. So education becomes one of the strongest pillars of Islamic societies. You have a responsibility to become educated enough to study the words of the Prophet, That requires a lot of education. While you're getting educated in that, you might as well get educated in other things too. So education becomes a big pillar of Islam. And so maintaining schools where people could learn became also gathering knowledge from all different other sources. Once you have a whole classroom full of educating people who are used to being educated, you have to keep feeding that. You have to keep feeding their education. So the knowledge and wisdom of those ancient cultures, the philosophers, the ancient Greeks, the scientists, the people who were learning all these things in the time of Socrates, those are gathered into libraries by the Muslims and maintained and taught and expounded upon. So about 100 years after Muhammad's life, they start to really invest in their own education. So over there on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, suddenly we have this golden age of knowledge where the Islamic caliphates are investing in university type knowledge all over the place. So they take the writings of antiquity and they form madrasas, which is a university. It's basically a university. They form madrasas, and you are trained in the ways of the Prophet, but you are also trained in how to think critically about things and how to gather knowledge and study subjects yourself. And they take ideas that were given to them by the ancients, by the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and on the other side of the land from the Indian subcontinent, they pull it together and they start to expound on it. So you end up with, oh, they're responsible for you having to learn trigonometry. By the way, that's entirely their fault. They created this whole subset of mathematics called calculus, and that was based on expanding the algebraic ideas of their predecessors. They took it and they made it into higher and higher and higher maths. They're responsible for taking the works of Copernicus and Ptolemy and figuring out more specifically how the movement of space happens. So they had more advanced astronomy. And they developed the science of optics, the idea of bending a lens so that vision could become clearer, which, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know how many of you rely on the science of optics, because some of you are secretly relying on the science of optics by putting contact lenses in. Cheaters. Anyway, I used to be able to wear contacts, but probably one of the biggest places they made advances was in the field of medicine. The Islamic Golden Age brought with it completely new, radical, revolutionary practices, like instead of having a medical person who goes around to people's houses, what if you gathered all the people that needed medical attention into the same building, but then separated them based on what their problem was? Created, I don't know, wards for people with different problems. So if somebody had a broken bone, they'd be in a different place than somebody who had, you know, a respiratory infection. What if you did that? That would be crazy, but wouldn't it make it easier to be able to have doctors all gathered in one place to treat all the patients? Radical. They invented this idea of somebody whose job it would be to gather all of the chemicals that you use, chemicals and herbs and I want to say potions, but that's not quite what I'm going for here. Mixtures, compounds that they had found to treat things, and gather that into one place where you could just go to there and get what you needed, and that would be somebody's job to mix it properly, rather than just giving you an idea of what you need to go look for. Maybe you make it at home and maybe it works. So they invented pharmacies, they invented hospitals, and they did one other thing that Christians didn't feel like they could do back in this time, because they were still pulling from Mosaic law, which is handling dead bodies. So that you could take it, you could still honor a person even though you were cutting them open after they were dead, so that you could study what actually happens on the interior of a human being. So they invented the science of anatomy, which is a good thing, because the medical field at the time was pretty big on humorism. Do y'all know what humors are? Yeah, they're fluids in your body. They're not real, but I mean, they are. Some of the fluids are real, but the idea that the way that they handled them, like, what were the humors?
Black bile, yellow bile, and blood.
Yeah, okay, so if you balance the fluids right, then you'll be healthy, right? So if there's a problem, the best thing you can do is rebalance the fluids by, like, oh, I don't know, bloodletting, for example. This is a great medical practice. Never seemed to work, but, you know, I mean, it was like anything else. You got to die of something, I guess. So The idea that you could rebalance the fluids in the body to make it by bloodletting was a pretty common medical practice that did not work.
Well, unfortunately.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
you know, Washington was bled 5 times in the day he died, and he kept on yelling, more, 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 and he ultimately died as a result of that.
Right. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to how long after this Washington was still being bloodletted and still died? Well, we know he was alive in 1789.
He died in 1799.
Yeah. So we're talking about almost 1,000 years after the beginning of the Islamic Golden Age. So if the Islamic Golden Age went from 786 to, what did I say, 1258, 500 years later, they're still using bloodletting to try to treat George Washington.
Almost like they didn't know.
Some people use, do people use bleaches for that?
Yeah, that was a rebalance the fluids thing. Rather than just pouring the blood out, let's suck it out
Yeah.
with small creatures. Yeah. So they debunked humorism by opening up the anatomy and saying, oh, there's like organs and stuff. So they figured out a lot of this. And one of the ways they did it was by going back in time to the Greek philosophers who had no problem with this before, before Jewish followers of Christ began to move in society where the ancient Greeks were. They had no problem opening up bodies and studying them. So they had made notations and they had made, studies of this, but that was kind of lost. And then reborn in the Islamic Golden Age. And then also they pulled from Indian medicine, which had its own rules about that sort of thing and had its own insights about that kind of thing. So they were able to put together some of the best medical treatment. They also used all of the Silk Road to advance their own technology, because like I said, it all pooled into the Silk Road and then pooled into the Mediterranean, but trade with the Mediterranean had kind of closed down. So when the Chinese invented gunpowder, for example, that pooled into Islamic held societies. When I'm going to say the Chinese because it was really Western China, we'll say the Western Chinese. When the Western Chinese began to improve on steel folding techniques and create stronger steel, that moved into the Islamic society and didn't necessarily get traded up with the northern Western European people. So they had advances in technology in their weapon making, in their ship building. They had ships that could maneuver around the African coastline, because this was their trading empire at the end of this Islamic Golden Age. Can y'all make out this green line? I don't know if you can actually see it from where you are. Can you see this? Okay, everything inside this big amoebus bubble is controlled by Islamic forces, is controlled by Islamic governors, by Islamic caliphates. So everywhere that's inside that bubble, they travel. So they need ways to travel. So for example, the shipbuilding technology that's brought to them from these island nations here becomes how they navigate around the coastline of Africa too. And this is technology that's not necessarily available to the residents of these areas up here that are outside of that Islamic expansion, because that's where the Roman Christians withdrew to, and it became its own sort of thing. Yes.
What stopped them on Madagascar? What stopped them on Madagascar?
Lack of interest, probably. They probably set up a trading port right here.
They saw the crickets big enough to eat carrots and said, no, we're good.
Yeah. These lines, I mean, the where these lines are drawn kind of reflects where ports were. So they probably established a port here, and then movement to and from that port around this part of the island. They just didn't have any interest in this part of it. Talking lions and zebras, who needs them? Vicious penguins. No, thank you.
They're not vicious, they're stupid.
Okay, so that's what's kind of happening on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. This Islamic Golden Age, massive expansion, control of the trade is all kind of happening on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. As a result, on the western side, what used to be the Christian Roman Empire has sort of stepped up and north and moved further and further into these hills and into these European countries where there are people. There are lots of people living there, the tribal sort of people, but they are living there. And they begin to sort of impose order that way. So order tends to flow into Europe from the south to the north. You find it in Rome, and it flows from the south to the north. But the forces that you have to contend with are pretty vicious. I mean, we're talking about Vikings and stuff, so we have Bavarian, not Bavarian, and not Prussian either, but like Black Forest, Germanic tribes, and the Romans are defeated by them actually. And then you have an attempt at establishing order, that everybody can kind of agree on. So the society that they build is very feudal. It's very strongman based. It's based on the triangle, which you knew was coming. At some point there was going to be a triangle. So, sorry. So the society that they build is actually based on a point of power at the top, both spiritually and militarily, a point of power at the top. And actually they sort of feed each other when this first starts, when king actually starts trying to unite enough small kingdoms to actually call himself a king. That's Charlemagne. One of the ways that he rises to power, and it's actually his father, but is by making a deal with the Pope. I'll conquer the land, and then you say that that's by divine right, and then I'll say that you have the right to say that's by divine right. And so you give power to me as the Pope, and I'll give power to you as the king, and between the two of us, we'll create this bigger, greater. And if you want to know more about that, I strongly recommend Medieval Civilizations by Dr. Nikashin, because you will learn all about Pepin and Charlemagne and all of those things. But the relationship between the king and the Pope is a mutual relationship. But it's also that there are many kings, but there's only one Pope. So the church crosses all of these borders and imposes its will on the military strongmen that are the kings. And that's how the feudal order goes. So in theory, you have the king who has dukes or earls, depending on how close they are to the coastline, who have fealty, serving them in fealty, who have knights, and then that whole society is built on peasants, right? Theoretically, if you are peasants, you're ruled by the king, but in reality, you're actually probably ruled by this knight, who's right here, because your day-to-day life is dictated by the local authority that's near you. And as a knight, you owe your fealty to the duke, and the duke owes his obedience to the king. But in reality, the strongest force here was the duke. The noblemen were much stronger than the kings usually. The same thing happens with the Pope. He appoints bishops. Those bishops appoint priests, and those priests serve the peasants. And because of this exchange of power between the king and the Pope is responsible for the salvation of your soul in everyday life. There are things that you have to check off in order to get to heaven. You have to be baptized. You have to have confessed your sins. You have to have received communion, all these things. And you have to be anointed by oil, before your death in order to get into heaven. And that's the priest's job to do that. So in reality, your day-to-day life is governed by the priest. And the priest owes his allegiance to the bishop, who owes it to the Pope, but in reality, the strong force here is the bishops. You with me? So there's what happens if you've got two strong dukes who both serve the same king?
Duke it out.
They duke it out, yes. So you end up with a lot of fighting forces tangling with each other, even though technically they're supposed to be under the king, who then can receive authority from the Pope. So that's what happens in Western and Northern. If you were a person from France during this time, you would not have called yourself a French person. You would have called yourself a Norman person because you're from the Dukedom of Normandy. Or you're from the Aquitaine, or you're from Gascony, so you would call yourself a Gascon. You would never call yourself a French person. This part right here is controlled by the king of all of France. This is the part that's controlled by the king. These people owe the king fealty, but they don't actually obey him very well. And in Germany, it's even worse. This is the Holy Roman Empire, and there is no Germany at this point. There are literally hundreds of kingdoms, of tiny little kingdoms. So Europe is kind of messy. In 1066, one of these dukes gets really, really big for his riches and decides to raid northward and to raid the island of England, which is above him, and sets up a kingdom on this island, and becomes both the King of England and the Duke of Normandy, who serves the King of France at the same time. When he does that, the church tells him not to in some ways, but then also blesses him in other ways, anoints him as the King of England, but says you still owe fealty to the King of France because you're really just a duke who got his own kingdom. And so it creates this like relationship between England and the rest of Europe that's always been a little bit twitchy. A relationship between England and the Pope that's always been a little bit twitchy. It starts this way and it never really gets on solid ground. You have lots of evidence all through history of popes arguing with the King of England.
And it was William the Conqueror that did that, right?
That was William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. Yes. So on the eastern side, we have dukes who are seeking power, and on the western side, we have Islamic forces moving into Turkey. Now, look at this map. Not that map, this map. Okay, so what we're talking about here is this part of the Mediterranean right here. Northern Africa and the Mesopotamian are held pretty much strongly by Islamic forces, by Islamic caliphates. But in the early 1200s, they begin to grow into the Mediterranean. They begin to move into this part, which this is Italy right here. This is like Rome. This is where Rome is. So we're kind of creeping in this expansionist direction towards the part of the Mediterranean that's supposed to be controlled by what used to be the Roman Christians and is now just the Catholic Christians. So they're creeping, and it's not, I don't want you to get the image of a, burning, conquering people coming in and like razing cities to the ground. And it wasn't like that. It was more of a, this used to be where we traded. Now this is where we trade. If you don't watch out, tomorrow we'll be trading right here. It gets closer and closer. And the relationship between the dukes and the Church of Rome and that are right on the edge of this conflict begin to reach out to Rome for help and say, you got to help us. The Turks, the Seljuk Turks are coming for us. So at the same time that the Seljuk Turks are starting to creep into the Mediterranean and start to move on Italy, which is where the Pope lives, and when knights and dukes are starting to get into fights with each other over France and other parts of England and starting to fight with each other, and the Pope is losing his authority over England, at the same time that happens, the Pope has a revelation from heaven that Jerusalem has been in the hands of the Muslims for too long and must be rescued. And that it is a divine call to the kings that they undertake this. And that if they do, then they will be guaranteed salvation in heaven. So I'm not going to say exactly what happened here, but I will say that all these things happen at the same time. So the speech that you can read, which is a World Civ I thing, but you can read the speech that the Pope gives when he says, we're going to go on a crusade, calls all the princes and knights and the king's sons to go to war. It doesn't just call the peasants to go, it calls them to go themselves. And so suddenly these knights who were at each other's throats over, these dukes that were at each other's throats and these kings and princes that were fighting, suddenly now they are all going to war together against a common enemy, which is the Turks. So the first crusade is in 1096. There's a second and a third and a fourth, and there are several little sub-crusades that happen, and the Christian forces never really take Jerusalem. They never take it back. As a matter of fact, the more times they go, the more land they lose. So Islamic territory actually grows as the crusades happen. But they bring back a lot of things with them when they do. They go into these areas to fight against the Islamic forces, and they find themselves, running into libraries and madrasas and places where doctors are doing things that they hadn't been doing up in Europe. And they find themselves right in the middle of all of these academic pursuits. And they bring a lot of that stuff back with them. So they bring back things like science, scientific advancement. They bring back the scientific method, which they didn't really have in Europe before this. That sounds weird because how many of y'all were schooled in the scientific method? Anybody not have to learn the scientific method in school? the idea that people did science without the scientific method before is a little baffling to me. I'm like, well, what'd they do? You know, the idea of medical care, hospitals, and an understanding of anatomy, those kind of things, they brought back the ancient philosophers because the Islamic people had maintained them in their original writing, had maintained them and recopied them and preserved them. And as they sacked cities moving through, the Crusaders were like, this is cool, and brought it back with them. So suddenly we have Aristotle coming back into Europe and coming back into style, and people reading this and being like, have you read this? You know, so suddenly there's a whole movement of philosophy and science and art that comes back from the Crusades. But the other thing they brought back with them was disease, because that Mediterranean border had created a block with the Silk Road. Now suddenly it's open again because of the Crusades. So diseases that came down the Silk Road are now able to get into Europe. And what would happen is a Crusader would come back sick to a major city, and the people that got infected as a result of these Crusaders coming back would be like, ah, there's disease in this city, and they'd flee to the countryside, taking the disease with them when they did. So these diseases spread very quickly among people. And these diseases, especially things like the Black Plague, which had such a high mortality rate and was so miserable. I don't have pictures, do I? No, I don't. Okay. I saved that from our Relative 1 class. I make you look at pictures. But the spread of the Black Plague and its connection to the Crusades is pretty obvious. Okay? It starts in like Upper Mongolia, and then it spreads, and it gets to Europe just as the Crusades are starting to get. Okay?
Was it 1346 to what time?
1353.
Yeah. Although I don't usually test you on dates. So I want us to think about for a second what that means, that these that this plague suddenly hit. There are some things that matter here. If you're peasants, if your entire town is being ravaged by plagues, and it doesn't seem to matter that you're a nobleman or a king, you can still be infected. All of the power structure gets shook. Now we've seen that a little bit over the last year. We've seen that things get shook by pandemics, right? When a pandemic comes through and people start to get sick, and this isn't even close to that level of death that they were seeing in this instance. I mean, we, all it took was a little pandemic for us to get pretty much shook from the ground up, right? So you have something that's wiping out huge swaths of the population, and if you used to have 200 peasants working on your land and now you have 14, what does that do to your land? It drops the value of the land, but what also does it do to your peasants? What do you do with the ones that survive?
Overwork them?
You overwork them or you pay them better. Either way, they begin to be more valuable. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you start to have value as a peasant because you're like, what if I decide not to work any harder than I did before? I mean, what are you going to do exactly? So you start to negotiate with the peasants, which creates a peasant class that's standing on its own feet. You also have this thing that's happening in the church. See, you've been told your whole life as a peasant that when it's time for you to die, a priest is supposed to come and do the sacrament of anointing the dying on you so you can go to heaven. That's a thing priests are supposed to do. But people are dying so fast that the priests literally can't do it. They can't get to everybody that's dying. The death toll is so high. And even if they could, a lot of times they don't. So what you have is peasants not getting their anointing. And if you are a survivor and you've lost both of your parents and your wife and 2 of your kids, and none of them got anointed by the local priest, do you believe they all went straight to hell? Or do you think maybe the priests weren't telling you the truth about that? Do you start to doubt what the priests have been telling you? Especially considering that the bishops are not doing any supplemental anointing. They are hiding in their palaces. The bishops are basically fortifying themselves inside forts and not dealing with the public at all. So we have a peasant class that is now demolished by the plague. Suddenly, survivors who are both valuable and angry at the church at the same time that all these ancient philosophers are coming back in. So things change very rapidly in Europe. The Turks eventually take Constantinople in 1453 and establish a power base on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, and that power base is not interested in negotiating anymore with crusading Christians. So they begin to set up not just an eastern bloc of the Mediterranean, but also a military response to the presence of other forces that come in. And that rise is called the Ottoman Empire. And I'm really going to cover more of that more on Thursday. Oh, so the Ottoman Empire rises up on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, and we're going to cover them on Thursday. In response to that, forces begin to amass in the Christian communities to try to push against Muslim incursion into the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula, and all these peninsulas are sticking out. For about 500 years, Spanish forces have been trying to push the Muslim forces off of the Iberian Peninsula. And in about 1519, they finally have their last battle of Granada, and they manage to push the Muslim forces off of the Iberian Peninsula. And they officially have the whole peninsula for Christ, is what they call it. The Reconquista, the reconquering. And they consider it a holy endeavor to do that. Even though actually Granada before this point, before these battles, was actually a city where there was all kinds of pluralism and tolerance, and people traded back and forth, and your next door neighbor might be Jewish and your other next door neighbor might be Muslim, and you didn't care. Even though it was a great city with lots of interaction and philosophy and cooperation and trade, because of this idea of the Reconquista, they get shoved out. So the Iberian Peninsula gets taken over, and this forms the power base for King Ferdinand and Queen
Say,
Isabella.
Mindy,
Yes.
could you go back to the last slide? I always thought it was 1492, which is actually in the little diagram, but then you say 1519. What is with that discrepancy?
What is with what discrepancy?
Well, between the dates, the one over the map says 1492, and in the where it says the Reconquista, it says 1519.
You know what? I'm not absolutely sure. Can I look it up and get back to you?
Sure.
Because I was under the impression that Granada stayed a state from 1492 all the way to 1519.
It could be possible that like all the fighting and stuff like that ended 1492, and it took till 1519 to make sure they were off the peninsula.
Yeah, and that's possible, but I don't know that it's true, so I want to look it up before I answer.
I mean, I always like 1492 because I can remember that.
Because that's when Columbus sailed.
Yeah,
Exactly.
1519 is when Cortez sailed. So there's a connection between those two events, but off the top of my head, I honestly can't remember what it was. Let me make sure I don't have it in my notes. But let me look at it and get back to you, okay, Sam?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think I have an answer here. Granada fell in 1492. You're right about that. From 1496 to 1519, Ferdinand and Isabella united all the kingdoms of Spain under one ruler. So the Battle of Granada was in 1492. And with the end of the Battle of Granada, suddenly you had all of these kingdoms that were Christian kingdoms now. Ferdinand and Isabella united them into one kingdom by 1519. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, that makes
Thanks for
sense.
pointing that out, Sam. Otherwise, I wouldn't have opened my notes. In 1496, Ferdinand and Isabella began. You have to understand, Ferdinand and Isabella's claim to the throne was kind of hazy. It was kind of sketchy, and I won't get into why, but their claim to the throne was sketchy. Whenever a king's claim to the throne is sketchy, it really matters what they do next. So their first goal was to marry their children off into power so that they would have the backing to hold on to their throne if there was any kind of challenge. They married their daughter off to one of the richest merchant families, the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were a family that was all throughout the Holy Roman Empire, and there were lots of them, but their strength was in their merchant class. They had mastered trade with the Mediterranean before it had been when they'd had, you know, between crusades, before the Ottomans really rose, the Habsburgs had formed trading alliances with them, kind of like war profiteering with the crusades. So they had grown into this extremely wealthy and extremely powerful family. Now, if you're a king, you can have all the bloodline you want to, but if you don't have the backing of wealth, you can't hold on to any kind of power. You have to have wealth in order to do it. And becoming king does not automatically make you wealthy. Becoming queen does not automatically bring wealth with it. Wealth comes from the merchant class. So you have to have alliances with the wealthy. And as soon as the Habsburgs started marrying into royalty, they became both. They became this massive family that was both wealthy and powerful. And in 1496, Ferdinand and Isabella married their daughter, who was insane, by the way, to one of the Habsburgs so that they could draw a line between their family and the Habsburgs. And as a result, they were able to put their son, Charles V, on the throne and basically take over the entire Holy Roman Empire, which was most of Europe. So when we talk about the showdown between Christians and Muslims, what we're actually going to talk about is a showdown between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. Okay? Yeah. So these are all the lands that are kind of held by the Habsburgs, and this is the Ottoman Empire. So when they actually come to blows over control of the Mediterranean, that's who's actually going to be fighting, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. Okay? And we're going to talk about that on Thursday. That's what we're going to talk about, is what exactly happens when those two communities collide with each other. In between now and then, I'd like you to take a look at your primary source document for this week, which is a letter. Nope, wrong week. You'll find it under your week 2, the Mediterranean, and it's a letter from a Fleming, an ambassador of the Habsburgs to the Holy Roman Empire, to the Ottoman court. He goes to the Ottoman court and he writes back about what he sees there. And in his letter, he tells the court, back the Habsburgs, why the Ottomans are so dangerous. And what I want you to do is kind of read it for that so we can discuss it on Thursday. Between now and then, you just have this assignment, which is just what cultural differences exist. And some of the answers to that will be in that document, and some of them will just be in your own research. What are the cultural differences that exist between the Christians and the Muslims that contribute to this conflict? What are the cultural differences that they have that make them enemies across the Mediterranean?
Are we about to get into the Janissaries?
Yes, Thursday is about the Janissaries. Very good. So, yeah, and you'll find that in here. His description of the Janissaries is actually kind of interesting.
Wadi and Taylor.
Huh?
Wadi and Taylor.
Well, okay, but also with flowers, though. I mean, if you can find the part where they talk about them holding bouquets of flowers. They're like vicious warriors, but they bring you flowers. Janissaries are cool. Okay, so this assignment, this like paragraph that I want you to write is here. We're talking about 100 words, 5 points, sometime before Sunday at midnight. Okay? Any questions? No? No questions? You sure? Okay, before you go, is there anybody who didn't get then onto the seating chart? Did anybody come in after I closed it? Okay, I apologize again for having to have a seating chart. I hate that for y'all.